It started with a smirk. Denzel Washington had been invited to a live town hall discussion on American identity, joined by leaders, intellectuals, and, unexpectedly, Senator John Kennedy. The expectation was clear: Denzel would inspire, charm, and maybe provoke. Kennedy? Most assumed he'd play defense. But when Denzel turned to Kennedy and said, "With all due respect, Senator, I've played roles with more depth than the ideas you've shared on race and struggle," the room changed. It wasn't just a jab, it was a dismissal. Of his intelligence. Of his experience. Of his roots. Kennedy didn't blink. He didn't shift. He let the room chuckle, even let Denzel smile a little too long. And then, he leaned forward. "You've memorized a lot of scripts in your life, Mr. Washington," Kennedy began, voice calm, words sharp. "But I lived the ones you think are fiction." Silence. He continued, "You mocked where I come from, but I'll tell you this, I didn't inherit a platform. I earned every inch of it, standing knee-deep in floodwaters in Louisiana, listening to stories no script ever dared write. Real pain. Real people. And yes, Mr. Washington, real policy." The crowd froze. For once, Denzel didn't have a line ready. His face twitched, not anger, not shame, just recognition. He'd underestimated his opponent. Kennedy wasn't here to act. He was here to speak. And the room? It had just changed again. Kennedy's words didn't just echo, they hit. And Denzel felt it. You could see it in the subtle drop of his shoulders, the tightening of his jaw, the way he shifted in his chair like he'd suddenly realized he wasn't on a movie set, but in a courtroom of ideas, and Kennedy was cross-examining him. The moderator tried to ease the tension. "Let's pivot," she suggested, with a nervous laugh. "Maybe something lighter, shared experiences?" But Kennedy wasn't done. He adjusted his glasses, then turned slightly toward the crowd, ignoring the cue to back off. "You know what gets me?" Kennedy said, his tone rising just a hair. "It's this idea that if you speak plain, if you don't dress your words up in Ivy League polish, you must be dumb, backward, a caricature. I've seen that look before. It was in your smirk, Denzel. But I've also seen that look in boardrooms that sent jobs overseas. In hearings where billionaires called working folks unskilled. I see it every time people are told their voices don't count because they don't say things the right way." Denzel leaned in this time, visibly tense. "You think I don't respect struggle? I've seen it. I've lived through it." Kennedy nodded slowly. "So have I. The difference is, I don't perform it. I legislate through it." That line landed hard. A gasp swept through the audience. Kennedy wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. Every syllable cut like a scalpel. Denzel opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. For a second, he looked lost. Not defeated. Just exposed. He hadn't expected fire from Kennedy. Certainly not this kind of fire. Measured. Relentless. Southern grit wrapped in legal steel. And in that moment, the balance shifted. This wasn't a celebrity segment anymore. It was a reckoning. The production crew behind the cameras had gone still. Not a single whisper. Not a single cough. Even the teleprompter operator paused, as if the script had officially lost control of the room. Kennedy didn't smile. He didn't lean back in triumph. He stayed rooted, almost heavy in his chair, eyes fixed, not on Denzel's fame, but on his words, his assumptions, the armor he wore like every celebrity in politics did. Denzel straightened himself. The tension in his body turned to posture. He looked out into the audience, then back at Kennedy. "You talk about struggle, Senator," he said, voice lower. "But don't pretend your kind of struggle is the only one. Try being a black man in Hollywood for 40 years and not selling out. Try speaking your mind and not getting blackballed." Kennedy nodded. "I don't pretend your path was easy. But you're not the only one with scars. The difference is, some of us don't get applause for ours." The room twitched again. One of the producers in the back mouthed, "Damn." And then Kennedy shifted, just slightly. "You mentioned being blackballed. You ever had a bridge collapse in your district because the funding went to a private resort? You ever had to bury a teenager because the insurance company stalled treatment?" He wasn't shouting. He was testifying. This isn't about who had it harder. It's about who used their voice to change systems, and who used it to sell tickets. Now the silence cut both ways. Denzel sat back, blinking. The bravado was still there, but it had cooled. This wasn't the role he signed up for. This wasn't a scene he could rewrite. Kennedy had flipped the script. And this audience, they weren't just fans. They were witnesses. And Kennedy? He was just getting started. Denzel folded his arms and forced a smile, but even that smile cracked at the edges. "You know what's funny, Senator? You keep talking like you're the only one in the trenches. But let's not forget, I've spoken in schools that wouldn't let you through the door. I've sat with mothers who lost their sons to systems you helped protect." Kennedy leaned forward, just a breath. Not aggressive. Just present. Immovable. "I've buried constituents who were killed by those same systems," he said. "And I didn't leave when the cameras stopped rolling." The line hit like gravel scraping pavement. No polish. Just truth. "You want to know the difference between us, Denzel?" Kennedy continued. "When a light goes out in your neighborhood, you post about it. When it happens in mine, I fight to change the grid." That silence returned, sharp, sobering. Denzel's fingers tapped his knee. Fast. Uncertain. For the first time, it wasn't clear if he was acting or reacting. The mask of performance had slipped, revealing something raw beneath, a man unprepared for this kind of challenge, not because he lacked power, but because he'd never had it tested here, in this kind of arena. And then Kennedy said it, the line that would replay in millions of clips before nightfall. "You don't get to lecture me about the people," Kennedy said. "Because I never left them." A hush. Then, from somewhere in the audience, a slow, deliberate clap. Denzel opened his mouth, but this time he looked at the floor first. His voice didn't come. Because for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, he wasn't the main character in the room. Kennedy stood up, adjusted his blazer, and turned to the crowd. "This ain't about celebrity. It's about service. And some of us still remember the difference." Backstage, a producer whispered into her headset, "This isn't going like we planned." In the control booth, someone had already begun cutting clips they knew would dominate TikTok, Twitter, and every cable segment before midnight. Because what was happening on that stage wasn't a debate. It was a dismantling. Kennedy returned to his seat slowly, never once breaking eye contact with Denzel. It wasn't gloating. It wasn't theatrical. It was a stare that said, "You walked into my world thinking it was your stage." Denzel cleared his throat. "I've earned my voice, Senator. I didn't inherit it. I fought for it." Kennedy raised an eyebrow. "You think I inherited this?" His voice didn't rise. It dropped, sharp and sudden, like a guillotine. "My name gave me a target, not a throne. I've had protesters spit at me for sharing my last name. I've had donors walk because I refused to vote their way. I've spent more nights in ERs and food pantries than Hollywood parties." Then came the shift. "And let's talk about earning it. You've earned your millions, your Oscars, your magazine covers. But have you ever earned the trust of a grieving mother? Have you ever earned the silence of a room full of veterans who just needed someone to fight for their benefits?" Denzel opened his mouth. Closed it. Kennedy didn't wait. "You earned the spotlight, Denzel. I respect that. But don't confuse applause with purpose." The audience was dead silent. Even the stage lights felt dimmer, like the room itself knew something heavier had settled. Denzel sat back, breathing through his nose, jaw tight. And then Kennedy delivered the final strike, not loud, not sharp, but with the calm precision of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "You mocked my background," he said. "But I built it brick by brick. And you? You just walked in and assumed it was a prop." The silence that followed didn't beg for a response. It sealed the round. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. You could feel it, like static before a storm. Even the audience, once leaning forward with anticipation, now sat still, gripped not by spectacle but by reckoning. This wasn't a Kennedy who'd traded on a name. This was a man who'd built fire with silence and turned humiliation into a mirror. Denzel shifted in his chair. His voice, when it returned, was lower. Less performative. "I never meant to disrespect your work," he said, measured. "But I have seen too many people in pain, people who look like me, left behind by men in suits quoting legislation." Kennedy nodded. Not dismissive. Not mocking. "And I've written legislation," he replied, while watching the same communities get sold out by speeches with no signatures at the bottom. The tension cracked, not with laughter, not with cheers, but with a sharp exhale from the crowd. Someone finally said what they were all thinking. "This ain't a movie." Kennedy leaned slightly toward Denzel, enough for his next words to land squarely across the gap between them. "You're not the villain here, Denzel. But you walked into this room playing a role. You thought I'd fold. Maybe you expected entitlement. Maybe you expected a name without a spine." Denzel looked up. "But what you didn't expect, was someone who's taken every punch that name came with, and still stood up every damn time." It was then that the silence shifted into respect. No fanfare. No applause. Just stillness. Because when a man says something that isn't for the camera, but for the country, you feel it differently. And Denzel did. He didn't flinch. Didn't counter. He just looked at Kennedy with the recognition of someone who knew they'd stepped into a fire and finally understood the heat. Kennedy adjusted his cufflink, calm, composed, unshaken. "Now," he said, "let's talk about the people. Not the ratings." For a moment, neither man spoke. The air wasn't tense, it was tight. Like everyone in the room was afraid to exhale and miss what might come next. Denzel finally broke the silence. "You know," he said, voice quieter now, "you sound like a man who's been carrying too much for too long." Kennedy didn't smile. "That's called public service." There it was again, no ego, no theatrics. "Just wait." Denzel nodded slowly, folding his hands in front of him, and the dynamic between them shifted once more. This wasn't a battle now. It was an audit. And Kennedy was leading the examination. "You came out here to challenge me," Kennedy continued, thinking this was about image. "But I don't trade in image. I trade in consequences." He tapped the table once. "I've seen what happens when we get it wrong. Kids without clean water. Veterans sleeping in their cars. Entire communities buried under policy that looked good in a headline but failed on the ground." Denzel looked visibly shaken, not angry, not offended. Just disarmed. "You think Hollywood raised me?" Kennedy asked, turning fully toward him now. "It didn't. Hardship did. Loss did. The people who gave me their last name didn't hand me power, they handed me responsibility." Then Kennedy did something unexpected. He reached across the table, not for a handshake, not to close the moment, but to draw a line. "You want to talk about real leadership? It starts with listening. Not mocking. Not performing. Listening." A producer whispered to a director, cut to wide shot. "Stay on Kennedy." Because in that instant, the narrative had flipped entirely. Denzel had come to expose a name. Kennedy exposed a truth. And the audience? They weren't watching a debate. They were watching a man carry the weight of a legacy, and make it heavier by choice. The camera slowly zoomed out, but the moment only grew sharper. Kennedy sat unmoved, a portrait of calm under fire. And Denzel, no longer towering with swagger, leaned back, contemplative, perhaps for the first time tonight genuinely unsure of what to say next. "You came in with a script," Kennedy said, voice low but steady. "But I didn't." Denzel let out a short breath, half frustrated, half amused. "I came to hold you accountable." "You came to humiliate," Kennedy countered. "And that's fine, if that's what helps you sleep. But when you mock the people doing the work, when you reduce sacrifice to soundbites, it doesn't just disrespect me, it disrespects every American relying on someone in this seat to do their job with integrity." He paused. "And you just met integrity." That line landed like a gavel. Denzel sat back, jaw tight. The audience didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They just watched. Because they knew, this wasn't just Kennedy defending himself. This was Kennedy defending the forgotten. "The name Kennedy doesn't protect me," he said. "It follows me. Every failure, every mistake, echoes louder because of it. But I don't run from it. I earn it." Then he turned to the crowd. "You can criticize me. You can disagree with me. Hell, you can vote me out. But don't ever say I didn't show up. Don't ever say I didn't fight." Denzel slowly leaned forward again. "You fight, huh?" Kennedy didn't blink. "Every day. For the folks who don't get booked on talk shows. For the ones who don't have producers writing their applause lines." Silence stretched long and thick. A camera operator whispered, "He's taking over the room." Because he was. This wasn't a conversation anymore, it was a statement. A reckoning wrapped in respect. And Denzel Washington, the man used to controlling every room he walked into, now found himself a witness to a man who never needed the spotlight to shine. He just needed a seat, and a reason. Kennedy had both. The tension hung in the air like smoke after a shot. No one moved. No one even sipped their coffee. The crew stared, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this moment stretch into legend. Kennedy didn't break eye contact. "See, Denzel," he said, "you play heroes. I don't blame you for that. You've inspired millions with those roles. But I don't get to walk off set at the end of the day. I don't have a director yelling, 'Cut,' when the hard part begins." Denzel blinked. A flash of something passed over his face. Was it discomfort, doubt, or just realization? "You think I don't know sacrifice?" Denzel shot back. "You think I haven't seen what this country does to people who look like me?" Kennedy nodded slowly. "I think you've seen it. I also think you've learned to sell it. Package it. Perform it." The words hit like cold steel. Not shouted. Just delivered. Quiet. Unapologetic. "You walked in thinking you were the conscience of this conversation," Kennedy continued. "But a conscience doesn't condescend. A conscience listens." Denzel looked down. For a split second, he looked like every American trying to decide if they'd just gone too far. Kennedy leaned forward. "I didn't come here to win an argument. I came here to be heard. To represent people who've never been in a studio, who've never had their name in lights, but who carry this country on their backs." The audience was breathless. "And if my accent, or my background, or my damn haircut makes me a joke to you, fine. But make no mistake, Mr. Washington, when I speak, I don't speak alone." Denzel's jaw tightened. Kennedy didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He simply said the line that would echo on social media for days. "You don't have to respect me. But you'll remember me." And in that moment, everyone watching knew, they would. Silence. Not the kind that begged to be broken. The kind that demanded to linger. Denzel Washington leaned back in his chair, arms crossed now, not in defiance, but in surrender. A quiet nod escaped him, subtle, but unmistakable. It wasn't approval. It was acknowledgement. Kennedy, still seated upright, didn't chase the moment. He let it speak for itself. "You know what the hardest part of this job is?" Kennedy asked calmly. "It's not the criticism. It's not the pressure. It's knowing that no matter how hard I fight, someone will always call it fake. A performance. A script." He turned slightly toward the audience. "But I'm not an actor. I don't have a role to play. I have people to answer to." Denzel sat forward, a reluctant fire flickering in his eyes. "And you think that gives you the right to lecture me?" "No," Kennedy replied, "but it gives me the obligation to speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's to someone I respect." That landed like thunder. And the word respect, that was the twist. It disarmed Denzel more than any retort could have. Because despite the verbal sparring, Kennedy never reduced him to a caricature. He honored him, even while dismantling him. Denzel looked down at the desk, then up. "You're not what I expected," he said, almost under his breath. Kennedy gave a faint nod. "Neither is this country. But I still believe in it." The studio erupted, not in applause, but in a rising murmur of stunned approval. You could feel it, something shifted. Not just in the room. In the narrative. Kennedy didn't rise in triumph. He didn't raise his fists or flash a grin. He just sat there. Grounded. Present. Unshaken. Denzel reached out. Not for show. Not for optics. But because something in him knew, he had come in with a sword and found himself disarmed by something rarer than outrage. Authenticity. They shook hands. The cameras caught it. The internet broke. And for once, a political moment wasn't about left or right, but about who stood. And who stood for something. Two different worlds. One stage. One, an Oscar-winning legend. The other, a senator who never needed a spotlight to speak truth. But that day, everything flipped. Denzel Washington walked in with the power of Hollywood. John Kennedy answered with the weight of real life. No scripts. No performances. Just truth. Kennedy didn't shout. He didn't perform. He didn't play to the crowd. He just stood his ground. And the moment Denzel dropped the act, when he saw that Kennedy wasn't playing, everything shifted. Because the loudest voice in the room was the one that didn't need to yell. This wasn't about right or left. Fame or politics. It was about who stood for something real. And Kennedy? He didn't just win the moment, he owned the message. So remember this. They can mock your background. Laugh at your roots. Doubt your worth. But if you stay grounded, stay real, one day, they'll have no choice but to listen. Just like Denzel did.